Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Coach and Benway podcast. I'm Coach Red Pill, joined by Dr. Benway, and we are going to be discussing the issue of class in America. Now, this is going to be a little bit different because Benway and I just said, okay, we're going to talk about class, and we didn't really even prepare anything for it. We're just going to dive into the topic. So, Benway, why don't you tell me your thoughts on the issue of class? I mean, my thoughts have always been, in the U.S., Americans tend to deny that there is such a thing as class. It's weirdly communist if you think about it.
Well, it's one of the most adamant things that are in the room that we never talk about in this country. Because in theory, yes, there is no class in a traditional sense. I mean, technically, we're not even allowed to have titles in this country by all the way back to the revolutionary days. That being said, that's a very simplistic view of class, right? It's like, oh, there is no Lord and Lady of Pennsylvania, or the Countess of Wisconsin, though that would be a wonderful title.
That would be.
But I think people use that as the limit to say there is no class, right? And I think it's more than just saying, oh, we don't acknowledge it. I think there's a certain degree of wish fulfillment, right? There's a certain degree of, if I say there's no class, then I assume there is no material barrier from where I am right now and where I want to go.
Yeah. Because, look, the issue of class, I come from an extremely classist society, Chile, which, just like the United States, doesn't have any kind of titled nobility or anything of the sort. But we all know who's who in the pecking order. We all know that certain people, they have the certain accent, they look a certain way, and they're higher on the totem pole. And it drives people crazy, and yet at the same time, it's inescapable that there are class differences. And here is the key issue, I think. It's that there are people who are better than others, who are just inherently better. They're just better looking, stronger, smarter, everything. Because we're not all equals. And I think that that's the problem with class, that we don't want to acknowledge it, that there are some people who are our betters, if you will. And there are those who are, well, not our betters. You know what I'm saying?
Well, I look at it a little differently. I mean, what you laid out is the view of a natural aristocracy, that there is just inherent in the breeding or whatever, that the natural inequality of humans necessitates, a hierarchy like that. I think you could say, yeah, there's probably some truth to that. But I also think hierarchy, aristocracy, the leadership class, if you will, is always a manifestation of some sort of act, political act in the past that has been entrenched, codified, and secured to ensure that they continue to rule. The example I always love to give, because I think it's just a good kind of proxy for everything, is in Japan, the current leadership of Japan, the political high leadership, the chairman's in charge of the karetsu groups, the companies, all whatnot. They're from the samurai class, but not just the samurai class in particular, because there's a lot of poor samurai or people from samurai class who are poor. They're the samurai who sided with the Meiji leadership in their revolution against the Tokugawa shogunate, and those who sided with the Tokugawa shogunate are not leaders in Japan. And I think that's largely true everywhere you go. So I do think there is an inherent tendency to class and leadership, basically who's in and who's out. You define barriers in order to kind of ensure some degree of stability. As to whether it's based purely on natural tendencies, TBD for me. But I think it exists regardless.
Oh, yeah. Well, in the United States, there is the what's class? Let's talk about a class in America. What are the class distinctions? Or how would you define those class distinctions, or how would you identify those class distinctions?
I mean, it to a certain degree, it relates to peripheral things that are outward signs of a manifest reality. So there's a certain degree of not just well, for a large part, your religion used to play a part of it.
Yeah.
And anybody who denied that really wasn't paying attention.
Yeah.
Just look at the founders; they're all Episcopalians.
Yeah.
Almost all of them. That's unfair. You go to the schools
Quakers,
people went to. Some Quakers. Yeah. You go to the schools. Everybody, at least for the longest time, the leadership class went to not even just the Ivy Leagues. It's basically Harvard, Yale, Princeton, a handful of others. It's grown somewhat. I'm basically describing the Protestant leadership of New England to a certain extent.
Yeah.
But that that's, I mean, they have in some sense faded away, but that that still kind of lingers on. And if you think of, for the longest time, look at the history of who becomes president of the United States. It's a very consistent group of guys, right? And it's not just like, oh, I'm giving credence to those fucking white men and their privileges. No, it's a very specific kind of white man.
Yeah.
It's a very specific, broadly New England, Middle Atlantic kind of white guy who does that. Yes, there are some Southerners who get in, but by and large, they still follow the mold. And let's also not forget the shock and the fear that was around the idea of Kennedy, a Catholic, and by the way, the lightest possible Catholic you could conceive of, being president.
Yeah. Yeah.
There would be no shock to that if you didn't presume going into that the restrictions on who is the leadership class vis-a-vis their religion wasn't part of the game. I don't think I've defined it fully. I got to let you kind of take over and start adding to it.
It seems to me that today there's an issue of there are different kinds of classes. It seems to me there's there's the economic classes, whereby there's the 1%, if you will, or the 1% of the 1%, whatever, the very top tier, and that is a surprisingly heterogeneous. How do you pronounce that word? I always have a hard time.
Heterogeneous
group of people. I mean, everybody from Jeff Bezos to Zuckerberg to Steve Jobs when he was alive, but Bill Gates. Okay, all of these people are the richest people in America. Warren Buffett, and they are all the men I've referred to are white men. But they are supremely capable. They got to the top by being the brainiest and the most ruthless. It's a combination of factors. Just brains enough is not enough to get you to the top. But the service class, the top 10%, that class of people who are the doctors and accountants and lawyers for the top tier, they are the interior decorators and what have you. That class tends to come from certain universities. And they wind up being the partners at the firm, and they are the guys who went to the good schools, or what is traditionally recognized as the good schools. I mean, I would guess that say 80% of that class went to the top 20 schools in America. I'm not just talking about the Ivies. I'm talking about Chicago, Stanford, MIT, Wellesley for women. Andover, Amherst, those kinds of schools, right? There are only I guess about a couple of dozen of those top tier schools that are selective. They are the selective schools that basically are weeding out for two qualities: IQ and docility. The willingness to not rock the boat, the willingness to go along, to comply. Compliance. Brains and compliance. That's what it seems to me that those schools are basically screening for: brains and compliance. And so those brainy, very compliant people get the opportunities in the upper tier jobs. I mean, we've talked about this before, how on YouTube we have so many brainy people who are so driven, who are so intelligent, and yet they have no place in the straight world, in the straight aristocracy, in the straight upper echelons of our society, because they're not compliant, because that's their problem. They're not complying with the rules. They're not going along. They don't go along to get along, or however the expression goes. They're non-compliant, quite frankly, and so they get they get pushed out of that top 10, top 20%, which by natural rights they should be a part of. But they're not, and so they're relegated to the doldrums of the online world, where they garner success because they are gifted and very driven. Because to be successful at YouTube, you have to work like a dog. It's not an easy thing. And so, but to the point of the class in America, that top tier, that leadership managerial class, they are very smart and very compliant, and they'll do what their masters tell them to do. They are the good doggies, good dog. You know what I mean? And that is kind of disturbing.
Well, I mean, I think there is certainly compliance, but I think everybody always is looking for compliance. I think the thing I have, the take on this I note, and it's perhaps through my education, is that the reason there is class, the reason you have all those rules for getting into the school, it's frankly a matter of logistics, right? Think about what a society would be, let's say, purely democratic. Literally anybody can come in or out of the key positions of power. Anybody who has minimal standards of merit, what have you. Mm-hmm. It's a logistical nightmare to manage that. Not the least of which you can't control who's coming in, so that does come to your compliance. But also, there's a certain degree of, there's just too much volume to control. I mean, the story one of my professors gave about how you think about, the rules of acceptance into a college, is that it can be arbitrary, but it still serves the function, which is just to limit the number of people, because they know there's more than they can ever handle.
Right.
And there's more, there's only so many jobs going around, and to a certain extent, you want to have your kind keep it as much as possible. Mm-hmm. So you can come up with arbitrary rules by saying, like, oh God, there are already over, like 50 times as many people that compared to slots that we have in the school, and all of them have a ACT or SAT scores over the minimum threshold. So you'll impose something random like, you have to play violin. That's who will let it.
Right.
I'm just literally making something up like that. Mm-hmm. Does violin inherently suggest that one is more capable than the other? No. Does it weed out the application pool to a manageable level for you? You're goddamn right it does. And so you go with it. One of the jokes that came across in recruiting I had during my my upper managerial class jobs, what have you, right? Mm-hmm. There was one person who always told the story that stuck with me, and I said that fundamentally is recruiting in a nutshell, or controlling the limits of the society, if you will. It was for a bulge bracket iBank. I don't think one of the biggest ones, but a good middle one. And it was like one of those stacks of resumes, like you couldn't even get through it. It was, I don't know how many hundred, let's say 500 plus.
Sure.
And the guy he takes half the pile and says, this firm doesn't want to hire anybody who's unlucky, and just throws it out. Okay. And then he goes through the second half of the list. But that, to me, summarized the whole thing. The goal isn't to find the best, right? The goal is to manage the pool, the population. And if you have that in mind, kind of like everything else in some sense, kind of falls into place. Whoever currently has the levers of power, by whatever means they got there, is going to create structures, reasonable structures. You can argue all you want that there's reasonableness to it. Ultimately, it isn't, but whatever, you can argue it. And they use that to kind of just to maintain control of things. I'm not saying anything that hasn't already been articulated in the likes of Max Weber. At the end of the day, mm-hmm. I mean, this is the iron logic of reason that is the girders, if you will, of a bureaucratized society. That's it in a nutshell. I'd love to say, there was the people in charge just naturally had the capabilities and the rights to do that. That tells you more about, to your point, yes, the pure economic classes. But there's a ruling class, if you will, right? And there's a ruling class in terms of who runs these companies and then who runs the government. Not necessarily the wealthiest, but certainly the people who are on the levers of power.
Yeah, I'm kind of conflicted about the issue of class, because see, this is my thinking. I feel that there is a natural hierarchy. There are some people who are better than others, just naturally better. and to deny it is kind of ridiculous. And on the one hand, but on the other hand, we need to put those people, those better people. We would think, as you know, you and I have discussed, we were raised as good liberal Democrats, not the British Party, but rather as, you know, the liberal tradition of the Enlightenment. And we are the John Stuart Mill notion of the aristocracy of the capable. And so you think to yourself, well, how do I get these better people, these more capable people, into positions of power, into positions of leadership? You know, and the mechanisms by which this happens are so inefficient, and also they're colored by the fact of nepotism. That those who reach power want their own children to reach those levers of power as well. They don't want some stranger's child replacing them, and so there's that issue. That nepotism, especially in a period of stability, inevitably rears its ugly head. And the problem, of course, is that, see, many times those who are capable have children who are not so capable, who are just less capable. And you see it in the decadent aristocrats of Europe. You know, I once saw this television show about, it was like these Tuscan properties, some entertainment television show kind of thing. And I was riveted by one episode because it was these adult siblings. They were Italian princes, right? A woman and a man. And the woman seemed all right. The man seemed so decadent, so decadent. He was like not merely effete, not homosexual, but just like just pathetic. You know, like over inbred. You know what I mean? And he was one of those people who was like forever enamored of the glorious past of his family, and he himself was a zero, you know. And I think to myself, my God, this is the descendant of of like one of the Medicis or something, who was somebody to be taken seriously, and this guy is a Jesus. I wouldn't want him anywhere near the levers of power. You see what I'm saying?
Well, that what you've manifested there is a representation of what it's kind of meant by that. I guess it's a meme, but it's at least an online graphic you'll see, which is hard times create strong men create good times create weak men create hard times, and that cycle continues. Right. So yes, an aristocracy entombed in its own amber can create something like that. But the natural question you said is like, how do we get the naturally good people in? All I could say is that historically, it's very clear. The leadership class, aristocracy, if you will, is replaced by one of three things: invasion, in other words, a population replacement. See, for example, the Norman invasion of Britain and who rules Britain since then. Incidentally, all the good-looking British people, if there are any, are from Norman stock. It's very clear. So that's one. The second one is war. Which is kind of like a variation on the invasion factor, but even just in the idea of, like, think of World War I. Once you kill off your prime stock, the next guys up come in. Incidentally, this can happen in smaller scale sense too. Think of the gay artistic scene in New York in the 80s.
Yeah,
the gay men you think of as the leading lights of today are the third row and fourth row and fifth row back from what it was in the 80s, because the guys who got laid died off fast.
Yeah.
And they were much different than this crowd, by the way. So that's another example that's not necessarily war, but that's population decimation. And then the last one is revolution. I gave the example in Japan where there's an exchange in leadership through violence. And one of those three is kind of how it does. Any other kind of peaceable way is just going to come through the natural mechanisms of the class structure, which is to say, yes, it can be somewhat permeable. You're going to have to inject new blood from time to time. This is why in the 19th century, the English aristocratic class was marrying wealthy American heiresses just so they could keep fucking injections of money and blood into the system. But beyond that, I mean, the structures are still very controlled as to who comes in. I feel like a dour person, but that's really the only ways I'm going to see this thing changing.
Yeah, I figure that revolution. I keep wondering where's the revolutionary class going to come from? Online. That's where it looks to me where the people who are capable but have been disenfranchised are congregating online, and they don't seem to be very willing or capable to organize themselves into any kind of force. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I don't even think it's a stated goal, frankly. Maybe in some small enclaves, they see themselves as recreating, or not even recreating. It doesn't even matter that you would recreate anything. You're just replacing the leadership class. But I think people tend to think smaller scale online. Generally, shit posting videos is a few hop, skips, and a jumps away between becoming the next ruling class of the country. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that the managerial class in the United States has got things locked down so tight that they're only going to be reacting to things. They're not really going to be concerned about their survival, but they'll be just constantly reacting to things, and it'll be like a slow decay in that direction. Uh, yeah.
There may be a replacement of some sort going on now. I mean, I think you hear a few folks talking about it. I think Faith Goldie has brought this up, and I think is reasonable that there will be something like a managerial class replacement, in that there is a desire, or not even a desire, there's just a perceived necessity to hire from China or India primarily to fill in the gaps
Hmm.
of the managerial class for a variety of reasons. In part because you can get smart people for cheap. Let's not kid ourselves. Um, but but there's also this perceived notion that like, oh, I can get the kind of people I want. I can sculpt them my way, as opposed to saying, hey, there's a lot of capable people domestically easily take on the leadership position, and we'll look for them. That may very well be happening. I know a lot. I've seen a lot more Asian and of faces of various stripes entering the leadership positions in this country intentionally. I would say. Think of Google, for example, and Microsoft, actually, both run by Indians now.
Hmm.
By Google, I mean the Google portion of Alphabet. Alphabet as a whole is still run by Eric, Larry, and Sergey, right?
Hmm. Larry Page, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm actually not too sure about who runs Alphabet, but I do feel that it's a figurehead. It's really the principal shareholders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, and to a lesser extent, Eric Schmidt. But that who gives a shit about the Google politics? Or Alphabet politics? What I'm interested in is, see, this is the thing. Americans are they don't seem class conscious, or they seem to go out of their way to erase class consciousness, which is really bizarre. Uh,
Well, what you're getting to is actually one of the great confounding questions for a lot of Marxist oriented historians, which is to say, Marxist class consciousness, the necessary precondition for a revolution
hmm.
in their conception, never successfully takes hold in the United States, and it's been a big, thing. Like, well, why the fuck, right?
Yeah.
And there's a number of different reasons for it. Some seem more interesting than others. I've forgotten half of them. Well, part you can say, well, there's a number of conflicting kind of identity groups that prevent from any kind of cohesiveness around an identity based on class. That's
Hmm.
arguably one. I don't know if that's my favorite. The other one is almost like a bureaucratic structural question, which is when you're in a parliamentary system in Europe, proportional representation is how you get in charge. So you actually have a lot more group mentality around the party. And from that, you have basically the only way you get votes through is if the uniformity of the party passes it through. In the United States, the system is much more individualistic. The party line vote, in other words, the percent of times a representative votes along the lines of the official party rule is much lower than in a parliamentary system,
Hmm.
significantly. So you actually have a lot of divide and conquer, like localizations that prevent cohesion
Hmm.
in the country. And the third is just too fucking big. And there's like I said, different takes on it, but it's a key issue because I don't think it's just about why isn't Marxism being adopted in the United States, right? It's fundamentally, to your point, why isn't class consciousness a thing here?
Yeah. I don't get it at all, um, because the class divides in the United States are so fucking obvious. You know, It's not just black and white, blacks and whites. I mean, those are ethnic identities, but there's also within blacks, for instance, you can tell the difference between an educated black and an uneducated black of a, not merely educated, no, but like of a just a better stock of black people or white people or any people. You can tell the difference right away, and they themselves are aware of it, but they sort of like pretend that it's not there. That's the thing.
Well,
It's not that
yeah.
they, it doesn't exist. It's rather, it does exist, but everybody studiously avoids it. I don't
Or
get
it's
it.
it's cloaked in language to really obscure the main issue. For example, I think oftentimes when people say, "Oh, it's that shit white people do," it's what white people like. What they're really saying is the upper and middle classes,
Yeah,
really, because that shit that's supposedly white people like that they refer to is applicable to every single person in my class. They all act that way. They all drink the the joke that in the office is like La Croix is a white person's way to poison you with hair tonic flavored water,
hmm,
which is true. It tastes that disgusting, but every fucker in my class loves La Croix. They think it's the next best thing. Uh, you go through all of the specific examples someone would give, like, "Oh, fucking white people." They mean class, but it's completely obscured, right, behind the that white identity. And not only that, the actual mechanisms by which they think they're confronting that, they want to confront class. What they're really just doing is going against identity. And what really happens for that is the class structure maintains,
mm,
the constituencies racially changes a little bit, or the gender,
yeah,
but the structure of the class remains the same.
yeah,
The only people who are punished are basically poor white people who weren't in the fucking group you were bitching about to be.
exactly, exactly right. Goddamn right. Yeah, because this white privilege shit. Yeah, how exactly is some guy from West Virginia, coal country, exactly privileged? Please do tell. I mean, yeah, it's ridiculous. But yeah, I think that you pretty much nailed it on the head. Because this lack of class consciousness leads to all kinds of weird confusions that do not make any sense. Where you have black people being affirmative actioned into high end universities and jobs and what have you, and they don't deserve it. These people do not deserve it because they are of the upper classes of their racial group. Yeah, they happen to be black, but they're upper class. They never suffered any kind of discrimination or any kind of grievance, and they're getting all these advantages. I mean, there were a number of black students when I was in college, and this is the early '90s, right? A number of black students who were from upscale backgrounds, very upscale backgrounds, and they had access to all kinds of things. But the thing is, see, they'd have been affirmative actioned, and they were the kinds of students who shouldn't have gone to an Ivy League school. They should have gone to a good, middle tier. I don't know. Middlebury is the only one I can think of offhand. Some sort of middle tier school, not a top tier school. They couldn't hack the work. It was beyond them. One of them I remember in particular got into a huge plagiarism scandal. Just blatant plagiarism, and it was just laughable, and everybody thought it was funny. But at the same time, everybody had to sort of like shut up because he was a black student, and the whole race thing, popped up and reared its ugly head. But the thing is, see, we all knew that this guy was from a fairly well-to-do background, so he wasn't underprivileged and had fucked up because of the lack of education or something like that. No, no, no. He was just a lazy bum who'd plagiarize some shit in order to look good. And it was that kind of thing of the confusion between class and race, and it was
Mhm.
always beneficial to the upper classes. That confusion, as you said, this white privilege is all about really class privilege, the upper class privilege, and it's confused with whites, and so the lower class whites suffer, and the upper class whites get off scot free. They get to join in the parade of down with white privilege as they enjoy their white privilege.
Hmm.
Well,
And you did see for a long time this was the strategy of a lot of the gentlemen in the Democratic Party. I think Beto O'Rourke is a wonderful example of this, which is effectively he is as white upper class, or at least upper middle class, as they can get, right?
yeah, he's
But I'm going to
yeah.
call myself Beto, and I'll make it seem like I am the son of Mexican immigrants and all of this other stuff. You think that, oh, if I play the game and talk about, oh, the lack of privilege and this, that, and the other, and I'm going to be a representative, the wretched of the earth kind of thing, that I'll get to effectively keep my position, but I play these games where I'm representing this other crowd. That's changing now, to be fair. I think your Ocasio Cortezes are going to be, kind of taking a little bit of that role in that party. But still, it's not as if at the end of the day, the current crop of the managerial and the upper classes are fundamentally different or have changed, their control over the matter. They may have changed their rhetoric, they may have changed the outward signs of their class. In other words, the conspicuous consumption is different. But by and large, it's still functioning, right? It's still there. Um, and it's all the typical strategies that anyone would employ to make it through the day in a complicated, changing world. Uh, I guess you could still say you and I are class traders to a certain extent because we're calling out the game and certainly arguing for, I guess, a sort of, if not dissolution, at least a drastic modification of what it is.
Yeah, my sense is that what's happened is that we've gone through too many decades of stability. And these decades of stability following the end of the Second World War have led to unintended consequences. The saying, hard men bring good times bring weak men bring hard times. Yeah, I think that's basically the wheel that we're on. Because if people say, "Oh, there hasn't been any stability," fuck yeah, there's been stability over the last 70 odd years. It's been incredibly stable. The situation is it's been like almost at a glacier pace in terms of change. Yeah, social change has happened, a little bit cataclysmically during the 60s and the advent of the birth control pill and the sexual revolution that came thereof. And sort of like in a slow boiling kind of way with the identity politics and educational monoculture that has emerged from the 90s and into the 2000s and the 2000 teens, right? But that's on a social level, yeah, but politically, things have been rock steady over the last 70 years.
Yeah, the question, who rules, hasn't changed fundamentally.
No.
Right? No. And that's the key, right? I mean, and even the outward signs, like there hasn't been a significant war of any kind. There have been economic recessions, but nothing that completely shattered, the economic system, right? Even the last recession we were in was pretty bad, but it wasn't anywhere near of pure society destruction. What has been occurring is a slow and steady erosion of certain significant swaths of people in this country, or at least the basic kind of expectation, of the post-war boon of the success. And that will naturally breed resentment. One would think, right, that group is in a position to take on more control. You would have thought, and I think this is what a lot of people on the right, particularly the dissident right, back in the day, would have hoped for within the likes of the Tea Party movement, right? It's at the very least they'll take over the old Republican Party, and the next manifestation of that, oh, Donald Trump, the new leadership on that. It's still moving at a glacier pace on that front.
Yeah, and the deep state, call it what you will, they got their hooks in real good in the body politic, and we see something similar in private enterprise because it's always like the same people who wind up on top. Like, take somebody like Sheryl Sandberg, right? Okay, 2 decades ago, the notion of Facebook just didn't exist. But somebody like Sheryl Sandberg was around, and she was bouncing around from job to job. And that kind of person, that kind of managerial class who went to the right schools, has got the right credentials, who's a smart person, but who'll, make a company fit in with the norm. I always think that it was incredibly shrewd of Zuckerberg to do that, to get people who were sort of like to put it weirdly, establishment corporatists who would bring
Right.
Facebook into the establishment corporate sphere. I thought that was an incredibly shrewd decision that he made. I don't know if he made it consciously or it just so happened that Sheryl Sandberg stumbled across his path and he figured, oh, she's good enough to run this shit, on a day-to-day basis, right? But it was the right choice. And the companies that have succeeded, the startups that have succeeded, have been like that. Whereas the companies that did not succeed or blew up, like Groupon, yeah, they blew up and they could have been big, but then they faded because they were unwilling to bring in that corporatist kind of managerial class, that connected managerial class. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, and Groupon's still lingering around trying to make a go of it. They're trying to do that now, perhaps too late. But yeah, I suspect either Zuckerberg intentionally or was guided to do that for the reasons you mentioned. And that almost always happens whenever some big drastic change come in. You reach a point where there's a desire for that, not just stability, but the desire of the outward appearance of we belong in your group,
We
right?
belong.
And
Yeah.
you get and yeah, sometimes it's hiring your Sheryl Sandbergs. Other times when you're kind of a startup and you get bought by a private equity firm, it's like, oh, now's the time to run it like a serious business. That's kind of honestly where a lot of my business is involved.
I've noticed something else that companies run.
And
I've noticed companies run by Jewish people or who are originated by Jewish people have this desire to belong very firmly, like Google and Facebook, both of them. Whereas MySpace, let me just look up who did MySpace. I'm trying to find who founded it. Tom Anderson, Krista Wolf, and John Hart. That doesn't sound like a bunch of Jews, in Harvard dorm rooms, right? Not like Zuckerberg and Eduardo, what's his name? Yeah, yeah, those. It seems that they would be much more aloof from that. And whereas people who are Jewish, because they have this desire to join in the establishment of wherever they happen to be living, because they feel alienated and vulnerable because of their outsider status as Jews, they'd be much more willing to bring in this managerial class, this professional establishment managerial class, to make their company be run like a quote unquote proper business. You see what I'm saying? Does this make any sense to you?
I honestly don't know enough, Jews intimately enough to really give a good take on that.
Mm-hmm.
What I can tell you, regardless of the ultimate cause, as soon as that lot, your Sheryl Sandbergs of the lot, come in, forget all notions of innovation, forget all notions of, oh, we're going to do something dramatic here. It is all about, you had a wonderful idea. We approve your idea. We are now going to run it to ensure that it continues in a way we deem efficient to generate the kind of continuing financial rewards that we're looking for. You be a good boy. You look good for the cameras. Talk the nice thing. Get people excited. We're going to be in charge of the situation.
Yeah. Because there's something to be said about sort of like ceding your business to the managerial class, because they'll run it properly. They'll certainly run it properly and run it efficiently, though without much vision. I mean, you sort of see that in what happened to Apple. That Apple in when it was, well, Steve Jobs was thrown aside by what's his name, Scully, and his board of very professional managerial types. And that was kind of interesting. I mean, Steve Jobs would have been an interesting person to talk about this particular issue, because I think he would have had a lot of insights into that. But to go back to this professional managerial class, that seems to be the modern day mandarins, the modern day, like, not aristocrats per se, but sort of like the like the I- the courtiers of the upper class,
Right.
you know what I'm saying? Like
Right. I mean, they I mean, for a long time they would have just been understood as the bourgeoisie,
yeah.
and then more specifically, the middle management bourgeoisie, as they're sometimes called. I
Hmm.
forget the specific term. I've forgotten it by now. But yeah, I mean, essentially, it's the person smart enough to do a lot of the quotidian tasks, but at the same time, a person concerned enough about their position in society to be worried about doing two drastically different things.
Mm.
You know,
Yeah.
so just the right amount of capability, just the right amount of fear of social embarrassment or social ruination, if you will.
Yeah.
Which basically sums up England to a T, to a certain respect. A lot of what the people who run England are like that.
Mm, yeah. It's well. I guess I'm trying to go back to the original issue of class and trying to understand why it is that we're so leery of talking about it self-consciously. And even though we're all so intensely aware of it, and we all dress to impress the class that we wish to belong to, um, and at the same time, we're a little bit afraid of dressing too much. I mean, like overplaying our hand. I mean, and you've seen that when people overplay their hand in their dress or their manner, that you realize they're just overplaying their hand. They're trying too hard, and the class that they wish to belong to, rejects them. It's so funny, because we think to ourselves that there is like a top class, a top tier class, and yesterday we were discussing Jacqueline Kennedy in the context of fashion. It's in one of the podcasts that we're releasing, so I don't know what order. But the point is, Jacqueline Kennedy, for all the notions that she was like American aristocracy or patrician or what have you, she felt socially insecure about some other group of people, some peers of hers, that she thought that they were like the cool kids. And ultimately, this whole social shit is all about the cool kids. Are you a part of the cool kids club? Are you or are you not? And if you're not, well, then you're nothing, or you feel yourself to be nothing. That somebody like Jacqueline Kennedy could feel socially insecure. It speaks volumes that everybody has a social insecurity. You know what I mean? And there's always some other class that you want to belong to.
Well, it's interesting. I've been watching. I'm not fully endorsing the show, I bet, if I am enjoying it. I've been watching a lot of The Crown recently,
Oh yeah, I haven't
and
watched
and
it.
and what's interesting about that, what you said, like the upper class is somewhat being equivalent to the cool kids. I would argue, at least recently, that has distinctly not been so. Right? If you think of Princess Margaret is always a great example in this. So Princess Margaret absolutely is obviously at the highest echelons of the English aristocracy, but even she felt it was a drudgery to it. Quite frankly, there was something inherently uncool about it. Her sister was frumpy. She was the one hanging out, partying with the Rolling Stones. She married a very famous, very capable photographer, ultimately becoming the Count of Snowdon. Uh, in a number of other people she did, right? And the cool people for a long time, even though, yeah, they were still elite, right? By
Hmm.
be capability, what have you. But they were the outward sign of their class, ironically, was complete déclasséness. Yeah, they probably, a lot of them got sourced from wealthier families, but some got sourced from middle class families. Others got sourced from wherever the fuck they came. But those were the cool kids, right? The guys who didn't entirely play the game, but could easily kind of swim their way between classes. So I think I mean, maybe American country is still different because we've drunk the Kool-Aid of liberalism too much to convince ourselves otherwise. But the older world, like the aristocracy, is not really the cool kids, right? They're particularly if they have the older sense of tradition and obligation, they're defined precisely by their lack of coolness. They are not a la mode. They are very much out of date. And some of the ones who hold fast to it really prefer that they're out of date. That's part of the value in their minds of what they do.
You're talking about Rees Mogg.
Well, he's certainly an example of it, although it's odd because he's Catholic. But yeah, he could very well be that. There's that a notable photo of him. I forgot what it was in relation to, but he's wearing a top hat and tailcoats, and I was the joke I always love is like he's the walking 19th century British Empire.
Yeah, yeah. The distinguished member for the 18th century. Yeah. Well, my feeling about class, I have a complicated relationship with class because in my own case, I was born upper class, and yet I learned to despise the upper class. Not because I was taught to despise the upper class, but because I found them kind of pathetic. You know, the ones who would talk the most about, you know, the great ancestors and what have you, were the ones whom I, on a personal level, thought were dumb, just stupid people. You know, there was this one cousin of mine, you know, who one time he started like lording it over me. You know, and we were adults, by the way. Okay, I wish I could say that this is what, you know, something childish that happened. No. He was a grown man, and he was started saying, well, you know, because of my my forefathers, you know, and my, you know, my aristocratic position or some shit like that. And he was speaking to me as if I didn't descend from the same people he did. Okay. And I'm like, who the fuck you think you're talking to? I told him, you know, and he was like, he got all flustered and like, oh, you know, like kind of like that, because he all of a sudden realized that the distinguished forefathers he was referring to were my distinguished forefathers too. So what the fuck, right? And you know, and he got all flustered, and the moment passed. But he was an idiot. He was a known incompetent and an imbecile, and so I came to just associate anybody who gave a shit about that with people who I didn't respect, whom I couldn't respect. And also I noticed too, growing up, the adults and the uncles who would most care about all this shit were the ones who had made the biggest hash of their lives. And so I just couldn't take that kind of stuff very seriously, because I thought to myself that if I am taking that shit seriously, then it's an admission that my life has been a ruin, that I have failed in my life. And I certainly don't want to be failing in my life. I don't want to be like one of these losers who's living in this tiny little apartment filled with very antique, all these antique bric-a-bracs that have been handed down and passed around, you know, by the deaths of various people, and that I've collected into this tiny little apartment, you know, with all of these memories of people who are long dead. I don't want that kind of life at all, right? I mean, that was my thinking, and that's why I sort of like reject that whole notion of aristocracy and you know, descending from illustrious people. It's like, ew. And yet at the same time, I realize that the more capable people of my society tend to be the ones who were descended of better people. Do you know something interesting, that they've made studies that people who are, you know, the upper classes tend to have more children, and most people who are alive today are more likely to be descendant of upper class people, and that lower class people and the bottom of the social hierarchy are less likely to have children who will survive 2 or 3 or 4 generations after they're gone. It's an interesting observation, and it seems to be true. I don't have at hand the study discussing this, but you can look for it. You know, it's not hard nowadays with Google and such. But yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense that upper classes are going to not merely procreate more, but procreate more successfully, because their children will be able to acquire some of the social connections that they had in order to advance their situation and have families of their own, children of their own, you know? And it's so this issue of class is not just an empty thing, because there is something at play, it seems to me, which is the possibility of procreation.
Well, I think all of those are certainly potential species of the thing, of the particulars class that I have could comment on. I think of it perhaps broadly, which is to say, yes, regardless of what brought you in, or the folks into the leadership class, the ruling class, however you want to phrase it, the aristocracy. What I have noticed largely is that group of people, as of now, and by now I mean, let's spread it out for how long you want. Let's say at least since World War. That crowd has neglected their stewardship of what the lands that they rule ostensibly. By that I mean, if you are going to be in a position where you think that this land or this people or this whatever is, yours to control by birthright or whatever your justification, you have a responsibility as well as a privilege, right? You get all the good stuff by virtue of ruling it, but you have the obligation to ensure that which you rule is healthy, right? You are the leader, act like one. And I just don't feel people are, if they're not, even if they're not acting like leaders, or even if they are acting like leaders, excuse me, they're making just continuously either bad decisions or decisions that are not with matter of concern for the people that they're supposed to be in charge of. And in that regard, my attitude is you have to be replaced one way or another. Because you're just not functioning in your duty. If this was a job, you should be fired.
Yeah, you're basically saying that they're not living up to noblesse oblige.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, that the upper classes have been infused with this hedonistic mentality that's rapacious, and they have these stabs at philanthropy, but it's for their own self-aggrandizement on the one hand, and on the other hand, and people hate to point this out, but it's obvious. See, a lot of these philanthropic foundations and such, they're great hedges against taxes, specifically inheritance tax and other ways of dodging liability, civil liability. I mean, if you donate all of your assets to a foundation and you control the foundation but you don't own it, then for all intents and purposes you can benefit from your fortune without having any of the legal liability, especially taxation, especially in the case of any kind of suit against you. That money is untouchable. And so many of these philanthropic foundations are just vehicles to shield money. Nobody talks about that. Nobody talks about that at all. They
It's the human fund from
What do you mean?
Seinfeld. So in Seinfeld, there was George receives a Christmas gift that is like a donation to this foundation has been made in your honor. And George's like, what the fuck? I want the gift. And so he creates his own foundation called the Human Fund just to give away fake gifts to people. And unfortunately, his company then decides, oh, you got what is that? He's like, oh, the Human Fund. It's blah, 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 blah. So the company donates a large amount of money to his charitable organization.
Yeah.
And he has to keep up the appearances that it's the Human Fund. It's a legitimate thing. It's just to fuck around with this, to prevent him from having to deal with obligations.
Yeah. That's basically the truth of those. Whenever they talk about Leo DiCaprio helping the environment and the Amazon rainforest and shit like that, oh, bullshit. The guy's flying around in a private jet, fucking a couple of Victoria's Secrets models, right? And he gives a shit about the environment. No, it's just an excuse so he can write off going to the Four Seasons in the Maldives and say he was, he was helping the environment and visiting, doing on-the-ground research or some shit like that. Come on, man. I mean, who's fooling who here, right? And you're right. It's so much of the upper classes today have this this rapacious look at the rest of society, the rest of the world, that they just want to take from it. And they have no conception whatsoever of any kind of service or stewardship or noblesse oblige. I mean, that is just out the window. Right? And it's
and their offspring take on these positions of nominal power, but do a kind of half-assed job or an annoying job at it. For example, I think people don't know that Anderson Cooper, I think, comes from the Astor family, right?
Yeah, he's a child of Gloria Vanderbilt.
Oh, Vanderbilt. Sorry, Gloria Vanderbilt. He has his position on CNN, probably, no doubt, related to that. Think of all of the Kennedy kids with their little roles. If you deserved it. You go down the list.
None of them,
right?
I mean, they're all they're just washouts. Yeah. I mean, that must be, frankly, by the way, thinking about old Joe Kennedy, that must be so disappointing to know that all of your grandchildren and great-grandchildren are zeros. To know that. Oh, that must be so frustrating, that none
He knew it the day his favorite son died.
The Joe Kennedy, yeah.
Yeah, Joe Jr., yeah.
Yeah. And it must be so heartbreaking to know that all of the your descendants are just incapable, are just second rate, because those Kennedys, I never met any of them myself, but I had a close friend who was friendly with them, and she said that they were awful. They were awful kids. And they were just spoiled rotten. They got whatever they wanted because the money was around, and they didn't ever wonder where the money was coming from. And this friend of mine, she was sort of like aristocratic, but no money. You know what I mean? And she basically said these kids were like, they would do rotten things. Like back when Rose Kennedy was alive, they would mix her pills, and she'd be like freaking the fuck out because of the kids having deliberately mixed her pills, which it's kind of awful if you think about it, and it shows something totally evil about the kids. Because, like, see, in my own case, I would never dream of fucking with my grandparents' pills. It just never occurred to me, okay? And so that it would occur to them and they would act on it. Jesus, what kind of awful kids are these? You know what I mean? But there you go. So, it's what the hell happened? That's the question I want to know.
I mean, that's $1 million question. I mean, it must have the clear.
Sorry, I'm not talking just about the Kennedys. I'm talking about like in general. What the hell happened?
Well,
just easy times. Just easy times.
In general, there was not a hard question asked of him. And now that things are getting harder, we see just how underprepared the situation is, or the people are.
Yeah.
Right? It's not like, I think about those old, the old boarding schools the aristocratic kids would have been sent to, and a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them had a mixture of mental training and physical training, emotional training. It was almost like you were in a boot camp, right? Preparing for war. There probably was a lot to that, but you were preparing the future leadership class for kind of all bunch of contingencies, right?
Yeah.
And you were training them in all of the knowledge that you thought would be necessary to get that done. Arguably, in one form of that has been the liberal education. I guarantee you liberal education is not being delivered anymore in any stretch of the term. At least not as it was understood at the time that it was founded. Very few schools are actually teaching the great books in a manner that they were intended to be taught. Right? I guarantee you, most people in the world today, even if they have gone to those elite universities, probably only a handful of them actually read, Aristotle, St. Augustine.
Yeah, none of them actually
go through the history. Yeah.
Well, so I guess that what we're really waiting for is like the revolution, like the Civil War. That's what we're waiting around for. That will sort out the current upper classes, because the current upper classes, they're such effete and pathetic. I despise them. They're so weak and selfish. And that's all I have to say about this particular topic, to tell you the truth. You?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I guess.
Well, it just need a new leadership class. That's all.
Bring on the revolution. Yeah, exactly. A la revolución, compañeros. So on that cheerful note, this has been the Coach and Benway podcast. We've been talking about class. Hope you've enjoyed the show, and we will talk to you soon. Take it easy.